I still can't forget the events of that night. It's funny how certain memories just stick with you, like a scar you can't get rid of, no matter how much time passes. I was on a road trip with my friend Leo. It was a typical evening, late at night, and we were driving down a long, empty stretch of highway. It had been raining heavily all day, and the roads were slick and dangerous. I wasn't thinking about much, just the hum of the tires against the wet road and the conversation we were having. It was one of those drives where everything seems peaceful and uneventful, the kind of drive you do without much thought. At that point, I was 25 and Leo and I were just out for a weekend escape. We were both in a phase of life where we didn't think much about anything that could go wrong. Out of nowhere, we saw her. A car pulled over to the side of the road with its hazard lights on. The rain had reduced visibility, but we could still make out a woman standing by the car, waving frantically for help. We slowed down and pulled over, thinking she might be in some sort of emergency. I didn't think twice about stopping. It's just what you do, right? I thought it was one of those situations where someone's stranded and needs a hand. The woman looked like she was in her mid-30s, with disheveled brown hair and a coat that looked too thin for the storm. Her face was pale, and there was a sort of desperation in her eyes. When I rolled down the window, she started speaking quickly, almost too fast to understand, saying her tire was flat and she couldn't wait for a tow truck. She begged us to give her a ride to the nearest service station, offering to pay us. I glanced at Leo, and he shrugged, saying it didn't seem like too big of a deal. We were only a few miles away from the next exit, so it made sense. I wasn't about to leave someone stranded in the rain. We agreed, thinking it would be a quick and simple favor. But as we pulled out onto the highway again, the tone of her voice shifted. It was subtle at first, just a slight change in her demeanor. But that subtle change felt off, like something didn't add up. I brushed it off at first, telling myself I was just overthinking. But that nagging feeling wouldn't go away. Things took a dark turn when we reached a point where the road curved slightly and became more secluded. I remember that exact moment, the moment my gut told me something was wrong. That's when I saw him. Out of nowhere, a man appeared from the woods, stepping into the middle of the road with a knife in his hand. He was tall, wearing a hooded sweatshirt, and his face was partially obscured by the hood, but the blade gleamed in the low light. The woman's frantic voice suddenly quieted, and I knew immediately we were in trouble. He marched towards our car, his steps deliberate and cold. I froze. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears as the man approached, and the woman didn't say a word. She was eerily calm now, almost like she had been expecting him. The man yanked the door open, his hand gripping the handle so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "Get out of the car," he growled, his voice rough and menacing. At that moment, I could feel the air shift. The calm of the night was replaced by pure tension. I glanced at Leo, and I saw the same realization in his eyes. We were in the middle of something dangerous. My body went numb. I didn't know what to do. For a split second, I considered just driving off, but the man's grip on the door was too strong, and there was no way we could outrun him. He gestured with the knife, ordering us out. The fear that rushed through me in that moment is hard to describe. My hands were shaking, my mind racing, but I somehow managed to open the door and step out. We backed away slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements. I don't even remember how we managed to do it, but somehow Leo and I managed to escape the car and get a few feet away. The man shouted something we couldn't hear, but it didn't matter. We were already running, darting into the woods. The rain was still coming down hard, and the wet ground made it hard to keep our footing. But we didn't stop. We ran until we couldn't hear the man's voice anymore. Only then did we slow down, both of us gasping for air and covered in mud. It felt like hours before we could even think straight. We stumbled upon a small gas station, and the first person we saw was the attendant, who looked at us like we were ghosts. We explained what had happened, and he immediately called the police. The feeling of dread didn't leave us even when the sirens started to approach. My heart was still racing as we waited for help. Leo and I couldn't stop talking, replaying the events in our minds, trying to make sense of what had just happened. When the police finally arrived, they took our statements, and that's when I learned something that made my stomach drop. The area we had been in was known for a string of similar crimes. There had been reports of drivers being targeted by carjackers who used the same tactics, stranded drivers desperate for help who fell victim to a well-planned scam. The woman, the man with the knife, it was all part of a bigger operation. The realization that we had narrowly escaped being victims of something like that hit me hard. Over the following days, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. We watched the news, and the story of what happened to us seemed like a warning. It wasn't just an isolated incident. There had been others, drivers who had been lured into the same trap, some of them not as lucky as we were. Every time I saw a car on the side of the road now, my heart skipped a beat. I couldn't help but think about how easily we could have been one of those victims. What if we hadn't reacted so quickly? What if we had been a little more trusting? What if we hadn't escaped when we did? Months passed, but I never truly forgot that night. The memory of the woman's desperate eyes, the man's threatening stance, and the way the air felt so heavy with danger stayed with me. It became a part of who I was, a reminder that danger can strike when you least expect it, that it can look like a simple roadside emergency, something as ordinary as a flat tire. I don't drive the highways at night anymore, and if I see someone stranded on the side of the road, I keep my distance. It's strange, the way fear works. It doesn't always make sense. But looking back, I know how close we came to falling into something much worse. Something that would have changed everything. It was during a solo trip when I started feeling the weight of the road catching up with me. I was driving aimlessly, enjoying the solitude of the journey and the freedom of being away from routine. The road seemed endless, and it had been hours since I'd seen any place to stop. When I finally spotted a small town by the side of the highway, I decided it was time to take a break. I was too tired to keep going without resting, so I pulled over and parked in front of a small cafe. It was the kind of place that seemed simple, almost out of an old movie, but welcoming, like it was inviting me to come in and forget the world outside for a while. As I walked in, the place was quiet, almost empty, with just a few tables occupied. I went up to the counter and ordered a coffee. The barista gave me a brief, polite smile before returning to what he was doing. I sat by the window, gazing out at the road I had just driven. That's when the man approached. He was tall, with graying hair and a friendly expression. There was something about him that struck me as odd, but I was so tired I didn't think too much about it. He started talking about the weather, the landscape around the town, mentioning how beautiful the area was, like he'd been here countless times. His eyes gleamed with a sort of familiarity that made me uncomfortable, but he kept smiling, genuinely but with a hint of mystery. The man, with a friendly tone, suggested I take a shortcut through a rural road to avoid the heavy traffic on the main highway. It'll save you time, and you'll see a beautiful part of the area, he said. I hesitated for a moment. The idea of taking a rural road as a shortcut seemed practical, but also a little suspicious. I was in an unfamiliar town, after all. But curiosity got the better of me, and with a nod, I thanked him and decided to take his advice. I didn't think twice before leaving, giving a nod of thanks to the man, who had already discreetly walked away. The road was narrow, flanked by tall trees that formed a green tunnel. With every kilometer, I felt more detached from civilization. The path was quiet, almost eerily so, which made me relax a little. I figured that at the end, I'd find some way to continue my journey, maybe a bigger road that would lead me back to the main highway. But as I neared the end of the shortcut, I realized that the road simply ended. There was no more pavement, just a strip of dirt that vanished into a vast, open space. There were no signs, no indication of where to go next. It was like the path had been erased from the map. I turned around and retraced my steps, thinking maybe I had missed something. That's when I noticed something even stranger. As I returned to the town, it was completely empty. Where there had been movement before, now there was nothing. No one was on the streets, not in the cafe, not at the gas station next door. The sound of my breath in the car seemed amplified, and the emptiness of the town left me uneasy. It felt like time had stopped there. As I left the town, I turned on the car radio to break the silence, and what I heard chilled me to the core. Several mysterious disappearances of travelers who had ventured down that same shortcut. The news spoke of people who had vanished without a trace after taking the rural road, lured by strangers offering shortcuts. I froze for a moment, the fear crawling through my body. The empty town, the strange man with his mysterious smile. Everything started to make sense in a way I didn't want to believe. I had fallen into a trap, something much bigger than I had imagined, something I still couldn't fully comprehend. Without looking back, I floored the gas pedal and drove toward the next town, with the feeling that maybe, just maybe, I had narrowly escaped something far more sinister than a lost shortcut. It was a rainy night, and my friend and I were driving down a deserted road, far from any town or gas station. We had just finished a trip, and the rain was relentless, making it harder to see the road. The sound of the rain hitting the windshield grew louder, almost drowning out the music playing on the radio. It was when we rounded a curve that we saw a young woman standing by the side of the road, with her car hood raised and the hazard lights blinking. I slowed down and pulled over next to her. She looked genuinely distressed, so I rolled down the window and asked if she needed help. With a kind smile, she explained that her car battery had died, and she seemed genuinely upset. Being a good Samaritan, I decided to stop and see what I could do. She mentioned that she didn't want to wait for a tow truck since the empty road could be dangerous, and if I had jumper cables, maybe I could help her start the car. I always carry jumper cables, so I agreed to give it a try. While I connected the cables and tried to start her car, she moved a bit closer and started chatting. "Do you live around here?" she asked, her tone curious. I answered quickly, trying to focus on what I was doing, but she kept talking. "And what do you do? Have you been to the town? I've lived there for a while. There's a party happening tonight, you should come. It'll be fun." Her questions kept coming, and they started to feel a little uncomfortable. It didn't seem normal, you know? I was just trying to help, but she wouldn't stop asking personal questions. She even commented on how my friend seemed to enjoy the weather, which struck me as odd because he hadn't said a word. After a few minutes, her car finally started, and she thanked me, but her tone shifted. "You're not leaving now, are you?" she said, almost eagerly. "There's a party in town. We just need a few more minutes. It'll be great for you." I felt a strange sensation in my chest, but I decided to go along with it. She seemed fine, and the invitation seemed friendly enough. Part of me still believed nothing was wrong. Maybe it was just the rain, the exhaustion, the mood. So, reluctantly, I agreed and started driving again, following her suggestion to take a shortcut. As we drove further down the road, things started to feel off. The surroundings became more isolated, and suddenly I realized that there were no more houses, no lights in sight. Everything around us felt darker, and I began to feel uneasy. When I glanced in the rearview mirror, I noticed another car was following us. It wasn't a coincidence. It kept a steady distance, but it was definitely behind us. I sped up, trying to get away from the car, but as soon as I did, the woman's car abruptly stopped in the middle of the road, for no apparent reason. My heart raced. I looked at my friend and saw the panic in his eyes too. That's when the headlights of the other car grew closer, and before we could do anything, the doors opened and shadowy figures emerged, walking toward us. Panic set in. My friend and I tried to get out of the car, but the situation was spiraling out of control. The woman was standing there, staring at us with a cold smile, no trace of friendliness left. "You think you can escape?" she said, her tone mocking our attempt to flee. In that moment, I knew something was terribly wrong. After a long confrontation and a series of events that seemed to defy reason, we finally managed to escape. Back in town, we heard on the news about a syndicate of kidnappers operating in the area, disguised as friendly drivers. The woman we had encountered was part of this network, helping lure innocent victims. I was shocked, speechless, thinking about how easily we had fallen for it. That night, not only was our trust shattered, but my perception of how quickly things can go wrong was completely changed. I'll never look at someone on the road the same way again.